Die Gedanken sind frei,
my thoughts freely flower.
die Gedanken sind frei.
The purpose of Freethought Forum is to be vigilant to the encroachment of religion into government and to educate the general public as to what a freethinker is.
No person can deny, die Gedanken sind frei. No person can deny, die Gedanken sind frei.
I think as I please, and this gives me pleasure.
My conscience decrees, this right I must.
It ain't so much a question of not knowing right from wrong. I've known what's right and wrong since I was 6. Thus begins the song of Ado Annie, the girl who can't say no, from Oklahoma. She says she's known since she was 6. But how does she know? Welcome to Freethought Forum. My name is Hugh Henry. We're going to talk about right and wrong and how do we know. Now, there's a judge in Alabama and some people who strongly agree with him that our law and our right and wrong are based on the 10 Commandments. And without them and God, we are lost. In his famous letter concerning toleration, John Locke excludes the toleration for atheists because they feel no obligation towards oaths or promises. God has always been and is the only possible source of morality, of knowing right and wrong. Or perhaps it began with eating apples. I get confused. Well, all God's religions have a version of the Golden Rule. Let's take a religion that embodies the highest teachings of Christ. Love your God and love your neighbor. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Our religion comes from India and was around the 17th and 18th centuries. Small dedicated teams of 3 men would roam the trade roads in the country. They were looking for a particular kind of man, alone, a good moral man, and one with no family or dependents. All conditions had to be met or they'd move on. If they found him in conversation, the conversationalist would gently hold his hands, another would point to a bird up in a tree, and the third would drop the sacred strangle cord around his throat. After that, the most senior would use the sacred mattock to bury him, dedicating his soul to Kali, knowing that this man's future would be enviable. They wished it could be done for them. They loved their God. They loved and did what they believed best for their neighbor. They were good men with the best intentions, called thuggees. These, of course, were not Christians, but heathens. Had to be educated. The British did that mostly through suppression and extermination, and I think we are all glad that they did, especially the Indians. Well, let's look at some Christian ideas of right and wrong in practice. Christians established special boarding schools for Native American children here and Aborigine children in Australia. They took them forcibly away from their parents and tribe, forbidding contact, and teaching them and punishing them for their own good for reverting to native ways, using native language, following native beliefs. In Ireland, we recently had a film, The Magdalen Laundry, about saving wayward girls and housing them permanently, in prison to save their souls. These facilities were open at least in the 1970s in Australia and Ireland. Looks like God isn't doing too well here. Okay, scientific and rational methods. Perhaps the greatest good for the greatest number, too. Now, that gets us into euthanasia and eugenics. There was a facility like the Magdalen Laundry for problem and substandard girls in the Red River, Alberta, Canada. It was like the Irish one, except it was scientific and it added sterilization. This was closed in the 1970s. How about Marxist ethics? Marxism being entirely logical, scientific history, scientific social engineering. The course of history was clear, could be scientifically proved. Nothing could prevent the inevitable outcome, but it could be delayed with much suffering. Much better to move it along quickly, work with it, re-educate, remove the blocks. Can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. Clear choice between more death and suffering or less. Do the surgery quick to minimize the suffering. cut out the disease. Nope, science doesn't lead to morality. All right, how about the will of the people, democracy? Let's introduce a term here, majoritarianism. The majority is always right. The original American Constitution had no rights, no intention for the Supreme Court to review laws themselves or strike them down. Though Virginia earlier, they had Jefferson's famous Bill of Rights. Why? Well, first, this was a new experiment. Republic, not tried since Greece. Either this works or we try something else. Government by the people should work, should respect rights as part of the design. Second objection, if we enumerate rights, they will be the only ones we have. But a Bill of Rights was insisted on. So after passing the Constitution, 10 amendments were passed. The 10th said that any powers not specifically given to the government are reserved to the states and the people thereof. This has been interpreted to cover the objection of enumerating rights. It has been used recently to delineate the right of privacy and person, as in Roe v. Wade and again in the recent Texas decision protecting acts between persons. Why the need for this new right, privacy? The founders didn't need it. Well, America was then a big frontier. If the neighbors didn't like what you did, you could move and start new with no reputation, complete privacy. That's what the Mormons did to Utah. When Utah was to be admitted as a state, a condition was the banning of polygamy and the renunciation of polygamy by the Mormon faith. Their new neighbor states didn't like that polygamy stuff. The greatest example of majoritarian structure is the English Parliament. What it passes is law. No reserved rights, no judicial review, that's it. England has no formal written constitution. There's not even something written that says when elections are to be held. It's all custom. Majoritarianism in America is Jacksonian democracy, the Andrew Jackson presidency. The majority of the people in the South wanted the Native Americans gone and their lands available. The tribes there had patterned their government as much as possible after the Anglos. Constitutions, judges, legislatures, the works. The states started taking land, the Indians went to court and won in the Supreme Court. Jackson said, Justice Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. He ignored the Supreme Court. Instead, the Native Americans were evicted in the costly trail of tears. In the Scopes trial, the teaching of evolution, Williams Jennings Bryan was a dedicated majoritarian all his life. If the will of the people of Tennessee was that the teachers whom they paid not teach evolution, so be it. Gee, we don't seem to be doing well at all. All right, well, let's go look at the 10 Commandments, and let's see what the penalties are, too. Let's see. Have no other gods before me. Recently, the Pope in Australia, speaking to the Catholics there, was saying that they were much too concerned with sports on Sunday and not going to church. I remember when I was a child, other parents dropping off children at church, going home, and then picking them up after Sunday school. Some would say our God comes in denominations not of Lutheran, Catholic, and Baptist, but in 5s, 10s, and 20s. A concept here from the law would be useful, de jure and de facto. De jure means what's the law. De facto means what is. Oh, Bible penalty for other gods? Stoned to death. No graven image. Penalty? Utterly destroyed? I don't know. I guess we're okay. Maybe Catholics? Not take the name of the Lord in vain. Well, we hear that every day. Penalty? Death. Keep the Sabbath holy. Well, we covered that in the first part of this discussion. Penalty? Death. Honor father and mother. Yeah, that's a nice thing to do. Let's see. Penalty? Death again. Not kill. Well, except all the penalties here. And when you go to war, you can kill just about anyone, can't you? Adultery. Yeah, we have that as a crime. Not uncommon. Penalty? Death again? Not steal. Now that should be universal. Except some societies have no concept of personal property. The Polynesians. Or the Americans, who had no concept of Native American property. False witness. Now that's a little touchy with our Christian president right now. Let's move on past that. Not to covet. Isn't that the basis for our economy through advertising? Penalty, none given. Well, de facto, this doesn't sound like the basis of our current law or morality exactly. Moses said this came from God himself, written by his dread hand, but it sounds a lot like older codes, though not the famous Code of Hammurabi. Someone on the net has done my research for me, so I shall be guilty of stealing here. Myth. Basis for all morality comes from the Bible. Fact. Very little of the Bible's moral code is original. Both the legal and salvation philosophies of the Old and New Testaments reflect those of cultures around them, due to much copying and borrowing of laws and ideas. Furthermore, all societies around the world have similar moral and legal codes, which is certainly not an accident. This belief requires an almost complete ignorance of the moral codes of all the other religions in the world. Interestingly enough, the moral codes of the world's religions bear a striking resemblance to each other, with only minor variations. Religions as different as Hinduism, Islam, and Buddhism all have prescriptions against killing, lying, cheating, stealing, etc. Christians may then object that there is something unique about the Bible that makes it superior moral code. Unfortunately for Christians, there is actually very little law in the Bible, either Old Testament or New, that is original. Consider the Torah of the ancient Jews. The laws of the Babylonians, Assyrians, Sumerians, Hammurabi, Eshchuna, Hittites, Mishnah, and Israelites all bear striking resemblance to each other due to widespread copying of laws. Shared social norms produced identical laws against sorcery, kidnapping, sale of an abducted person, false witness, business, dishonesty, bribing judges, property right violations, shutting off irrigation canals used by others, etc. The complete list of identical laws and customs is quite extensive. Nor is the New Testament's approach to the law unique. Most Christians can probably think of nothing more unique than the Apostle Paul's approach to the law, but any student of ancient Greece knows otherwise. Many of the themes that fill Paul's writings were lifted from his Greco-Roman background. During New Testament times, the Greco-Roman world was filled with mystery cults, sporting such names as the Eleusinian Mysteries, the Orphic Mysteries, the Attis-Adonis Mysteries, the Isis-Osiris Mysteries, Mithraism, and many others. A common feature of these secret cults was a belief in a heroic redeemer, a heavenly being who would visit earth in human form, battle evil, die a sacrificial death, rise from the dead, and ascend to heaven, offering salvation from death to all who follow him. Another influence on the New Testament was Greek philosophy. In particular, Greek dualism taught that the world was sharply divided into opposites, good and evil, body and soul, man and woman, hot and cold, life and death, etc. Now the Greeks, from Plato on, had taught that the body is evil, the soul is pure. The ancient Jews had never believed this. They considered both body and soul to be the masterwork of God's creation, which he had pronounced good. But Paul, taking a page from Plato, wrote, "This I say then, walk in the Spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the flesh lusteth against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh, and these are contrary one to the other." My thanks to Steve Kangas, though I cannot verify the reliability of this source. My own writings over a long period of time confirm this material for me, and later programs here will deal specifically with the Greek philosophical doctrine in Christianity. Well, we can at least say something about our laws and their origins. First, a definition. Law. That's when the state not only decides something is right or wrong, but backs it with coercive power. If you are wrong, you are in court and the sheriff comes calling. Okay, Romans. They had an extensive body of civil law that fascinated the scholars of the Church of the Middle and scholars and the Church of the Middle Ages after they discovered it. It was all carefully based on reason and logic. Roman criminal code. None, really. What the emperor said, or the governor, was what happened. If Pilate decided you need crucifying, he didn't have to consult a law book. He did have to answer to his superior for good judgment. And in fact, Pilate was fired for being unjust and cruel. Western law is based on a mix of Roman civil law and Saxon tradition. There is also the idea of precedent. If the situation is similar enough to one before, and there a just decision was made, then the decision should be exactly the same as last time. The musical Fiddler on the Roof deals with tradition. Without our traditions, we would be like a fiddler on the roof, balancing with difficulty and headed for a dangerous fall. But as the show continues, Tev, who said this, defies tradition out of love for his daughters. The first daughter marries for love, not what was arranged for her. The second marries a Jewish radical, and they will live a life on the run, but she loves him. At this point, Tev's horse dies, and he must pull his milk cart himself. The last daughter marries a Russian, a non-Jew and an enemy, but she loves him. This time the village must be abandoned, and they lose everything. Breaking tradition, even for the love of your daughters, costs. But that still doesn't help us with how do we know what's right and wrong. This is a one-volume survey of every significant ethical theory, every school, every edition of any importance, from the beginning of ethical history to the present for Western civilization. It's about one paragraph or page, or rarely several pages, on each of 300 pages of text, 100 pages of biography. Phew. Well, we won't take all, but let's see what we can do. Before that, this is Hugh Henry and Freethought Forum trying to answer the question, right and wrong. How do we know? All right, here we go. Hang on. The Greeks. There was a concept of the good life measured as a whole, eudaimonia. Good was living a good life, end to end, a life of goodness. There is the parable of Cleomen and Vitus. These are two strapping, beautiful boys on the edge of manhood. Their mother is extremely proud of them. The morning comes when mother absolutely must get to the temple on time with her offering in the ox cart or incur the wrath of the goddess, but the ox has died. So her two good boys haul the cart to the temple and collapse from exhaustion. Mom is so proud she prays to the goddess that they should have a good life, eudaimonia. The goddess, being a practical and efficient bent, solves the problem, and the two boys lying on the steps of the temple never wake up. They're dead, and they had a eudaimonic life. Request granted. And this was an acceptable happy end for the Greeks. The expression, only the good die young, may be older than we think. Ethics as how to live the good life dominated the field for a long time, right up to modern time. This is goal-oriented, how man will best live and act so that he will reach his final objective as a man. Modern ethics has dropped that for the question of judgment. How can one explain oughtness in human experience? Thomas E. Hill provided a classification of ethical theories in his book, Contemporary Ethical Theories. They can be skeptical, which is probably me, approbative, which will be Martin Luther, process, psychological value, metaphysical, or intuitive. I'll take the last one. If you didn't understand all that, I didn't either, but let's push on. We must deal with ethics of my favorite saint, St. Augustine, who mixed an awful lot of Plato into Christianity. Many consider his the greatest example of Christian ethics. He lives at the end of Rome and near the very beginning of Christianity as a philosophy with some thought and reason behind it. For him, God, of course, is the source. But for Augustine, a person must be moved by the love of God before he can get any credit for acting in conformity with moral law. Love and do what you will, Augustine said, when he meant a man who truly loves God will always do the right thing. Medieval ethics, 13th to 15th centuries, the time of the first universities. A very large number of men are interested in ethics. This is the time of right reason ethics. Everything God made was good and made for a reason. There is a reason for each human being, and that reason exists in the mind of God. A man is moral when he acts according to his eternal reason in the mind of God. Humanist ethics. Again, the goal is God, but the focus is on man and his free will. Man, in contrast to every other creature, can make of himself what he will, but still obligated to follow God's laws. Most unusual is Thomas More's utopia. Utopians follow pleasure limited only by a reasonable concern for the welfare of society. Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, approbative ethics. The only true moral rules are divine commandments. They have no further rationale or justification than that they are injunctions of God. So much for philosophy. Case closed. British egoism. Thomas Hobbes, very important. 3 systems of ethics, one like Martin Luther. The second, social utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number, and a new one, egoism. Moral good and evil are equivalent to pleasure and pain for individual man. There, says Hobbes, that'll cover everything. Let's get into that last one more. It is natural and so reasonable for each individual to aim solely at his own preservation or pleasure. So a man be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. Do not that to another which thou wouldst not have done to thyself. This stuff set off a surprising storm of criticism that was ethics itself for a long while. Deist ethics. Since some of our country's founders were deists, not Christian, we better find out about this. William Wollaston, 1659 to 1724, Religion of Nature Delineated, written in 1722, the best thing on deist ethics. First section, religion. First discussion, truth. The conformity of those words and signs by which are expressed to the things themselves, or, as he frequently said, everything is what it is. If there is a supreme being, then he is the author of nature and is truth himself, and his will be revealed in the books of nature itself. We have been reading those books ever since as science. Or as Alexander Pope said, whatever is right. Okay, it's getting late and dense. Let's move on here. Modern ethics. Utilitarianism. The greatest good for the greatest number. Intuitionism. A person directly knows or feels aught or good of an action or moral judgment without any need to consider other items such as justification or even consequences. It includes a number of theories, but here we will concentrate on subjective attitude, subjectivist ethics, something experienced within the moral person, which gets us to a favorite of mine, David Hume, a nasty, skeptical Scotsman. He distrusts deductive reasoning in ethics, doesn't believe that reason can command the human will, doesn't really believe that there are persons, just collections of discrete impressions. Forceful perceptions are impressions. Weak ones are ideas. Quote, all these other systems concur in the opinion that morality, like truth, is discerned merely by ideas and by their juxtaposition and comparison. Since morals, therefore, have an influence on action, it follows that they cannot be derived from reason, and that because reason alone, as we have already proved, can never have such an influence. Wow. So all these bull sessions about right and wrong are just bull. They don't actually cause any action, just more discussion. If reason cannot be a source of action, then feelings can. Sympathy is important to Hume's ethics. He later edited that to be humanity. Finally, and this is so great a quote, I got to do it in full. In every system of morality, which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked, the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning, and establishes the being of God, or makes observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions, is and not, I meet with no propositions that are not connected with ought and ought not. As this affirmation, it is necessary, as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, it is necessary that it should be explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others which are entirely different from it. 20th century ethics has been how the heck to solve this relation of what is to what ought. Hume's influence in ethics has been extensive and profound. Adam Smith, the pioneer political economist, was quite impressed, and he was a professor of moral philosophy, which gets us to Thomas Reid, his successor in that position, and the founder of common sense philosophy. It's not all that subtle. You have a conscience which needs a moral instruction and guidance to develop, then use it. Biblically oriented, middle-of-the-road common sense ethics from Scotland became a pioneer influence on higher education in American thought through John Witherspoon, the president and philosophy teacher in 1768 at what later became Princeton University. All right, Immanuel Kant, quick. 1. To have moral worth, an action must be from duty. 2. Action does not derive its worth from results. Results don't count. Duty is necessary to act out of respect for the law. Laws. Act only according to the maxim by which it can at the same time will that it should be a universal law. Act as though the maxim of your action were, by your will, to become a universal law. And finally, act so that you treat humanity, whether your own person or in that of another, always as an end, never as a means only. Don't use people. We are finally up to current ethics and moving fast. Axiological ethics. Axiology is the study of values. I did a program on what sociological study reveals as American values. The family value is much talked about but never named. Value is an object of interest. Interest here means to be for or against something. Now it concludes a lot of theories, but we're not going to get specific. Self-realization ethics. Moral good activity fulfills or perfects the person in some way. Naturalistic ethics define a moral good in terms of certain elements of our ordinary experience in life. Contemporary versions stress empirical, scientific, non-supernatural approach. First, all explanations are discussed in terms of this world and is opposed to the use of transcendental principles such as God or the ideal absolute. Second, data of ethical philosophy include not only the presentations of ordinary experience, but also the findings of science. Third, the dedication to the notion of ongoing progress of the continued advance of man and their higher institution toward higher levels. Change is improvement. Fourth, ethical statements may be true and capable of verification. Sounds good, eh? Gets us into evolutionary ethics based on Darwin, racism, social Darwinism, Freud, and all that suppressed sex stuff. It also gets us to William James, much better, and finally John Dewey, who said, "Every moral situation is unique and cannot be judged by any made law or rule. Each must be faced pragmatically. An intelligent and serious inquiry is required to come up with a judgment and choice concerning a given situation. These are the best that can be made in view of the predictable consequences of proposed action." Yeah, finally. All right, I will not go into existentialist ethics. I just won't. I don't have a beret, I don't have bongos, and we don't have the time. Conclusion, my take. Ethics is a branch of knowledge like art, or the law, or government, or belief systems, that while informed by logic and science, isn't logical. An example, our evolving view of homosexual behavior and attitude. Thanks to science, we now know that it is not evil, it is not harmful to the person, it is not mental disease, it is not contagious and could be genetic, it seems to set for life, homosexual parents do not raise homosexual person. If it matters, biology has shown that it is not unnatural and it is observed in animals under natural conditions. That's what science can tell us today until they change their minds. It does not tell us if it's right or wrong, but it does inform our decision. Nor can we decide scientifically. Mark Twain, one of those moral writers in America, had something that applies too. It ain't what you don't know that hurts, it's what you think you know that ain't so. Ado Annie was taught right from wrong, but she didn't follow it. George Bernard Shaw said that person's creed is not what he said, but consisted of the assumptions upon which he habitually acted. It wasn't her creed. She found that saying no would not let her do it. In the last act of the musical, she gets married, and is always presumed this solves her problem. And they lived happily ever after. But this is not real life. This is Hugh Henry doing the best I can. I would like to dedicate this program first to Catherine Feringer, who founded it so many years ago, and for those who helped keep it going. This has been Freethought Forum.
I think as I please, and this gives me pleasure.
My conscience decrees, this right I must treasure.
My thoughts will not cater
To duke or dictator, no person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei, no person can deny. Die Gedanken